This week, it's a conversation with documentary filmmaker Nicholas Sherman, director of Soundtracker, a portrait of sound artist Gordon Hempton. It's the marketplace of ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. It's the marketplace of ideas. I am your man of letters and sound waves, Colin Marshall, here to talk about a documentary that really brings together, I think, two threads that have been developing on the conversations on this show. We've been talking a lot about sound, about field recording, about our sonic environment, let's say. We've been talking about film, especially documentary film. We've been talking about sort of the way to convey something real in sound and in image together. And the man I'm talking to today, Nicholas Sherman, is the director of Soundtracker. This is the movie that brings together these two threads. It's a portrait of a field recordist named Gordon Hempton. Nicholas, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
The first thing I want to ask is, well, I'll bring up a line. I'll quote Gordon, something he says in the movie. He says, "I suppose I have great potential for being an eccentric." And eccentric is one of the words you can use to describe Gordon after you see him and how he is in your film Soundtracker. But by the end, that's not necessarily the word I think somebody would use, and it's certainly not the only one, even if they would still use it, that they would use. How do you describe Gordon, knowing him personally?
Well, I would describe Gordon as a deeply passionate individual who's pursued a path in his life that is totally unique. There are a lot of sound recordists. There aren't probably that many sound recordists who do what Gordon does full time. And there are others, but probably most of us don't know them. So his job, by definition, kind of sets him apart from most people in society. And I think that contributes to him sounding eccentric. But I would say it's more just that he's passionate about something that a lot of people don't have a lot of knowledge about. But outside of his eccentricities, he's a really social person. Some might think that he's because he spends so much time alone in the middle of the wilderness that he would be this solitary lone figure. But he's actually quite engaging. He's funny. He's always got something witty to say. He's a great conversationalist too.
And I'm looking at the cover of the movie now, of the DVD box, and you see Gordon looking upward and holding onto his microphone, which he calls, I believe, Fritz. And it's this thing I've actually seen a couple times before. It's this head-shaped binaural microphone, presumably to record sounds as a human head would hear them. And it's interesting because you see this guy going around with this unusual gear, doing this unusual thing, and you see him, of course, in your movie on this long road trip to collect sort of this perfect field recording, and we'll get to talking about the details of that. But it's funny in a sense that it doesn't seem like the point needs to be made ultimately, that Gordon Hempton isn't a weird guy, because there are things on the surface, like you allude to, people might think he's not social, that make him seem like he might be weird. But this is the most non-weird guy I've seen at the center of a documentary. I mean, did you have it in your mind to get it across that this is not a weird man?
Yeah, that's an interesting statement, just what you said about the most non-weird guy at the center of a documentary, because it's interesting when the film gets selected to film festivals. It's playing in Calgary in a couple weeks. One of the subgenres for classifying it was, I forget what it was, but it was something like oddball characters. And yet it'll play at a film festival like the Mountain Film Festival in Telluride, which is sort of for adventurists and mountaineers and outdoorsmen, environmentalists. And there it's under the changing the world or deeply engaged subgenre. So I think a lot of it has to do with where you stand in the world, maybe. So I guess I was sort of playing with that. I mean, I'm aware that an image of Gordon holding a microphone shaped like a human head, that's a kind of a compelling image, and some people will think that's crazy, and others will think, wow, that's fascinating. I kind of used that to help get into the film. We all have a little bit of both within us, and I think Gordon does as well. but it's more. I think it's more of a personal decision for the viewer to watch to decide whether he's eccentric or whether he's not, or whether we're all eccentric or not.
I imagine the reactions you've seen to the film, or you've heard about the film, have shown you that you've seen probably a huge range of perceptions of what Gordon is.
Yeah, it all depends on the audience. We screened it for what I would call my classic niche audience, which was the Nature Sound Society annual field recording workshop. So it was a group of like 24 field recordists.
This is
and
a
so
sympathetic
we're all
crowd.
kind of like sound geeks, and so they liked the film. We had more of a technical discussion of audio. But then when I would screen at Hot Docs in Toronto to more of an art house, urban crowd, then it's a much different experience. The laughter comes in different moments. The groans and the sighs come in different moments. It's always kind of interesting. It's always fun as a filmmaker to work so long on a project and then to finally get to screen it with an audience. But one of the most revealing things has been how the audience reacts to it differently. And sometimes it reacts. There's a whole other conversation about the sort of momentum of an audience. If you have one person in the audience who starts laughing, they can kind of set the tone for the whole movie. Sometimes there have been laughter in moments where I didn't even conceive that was a funny scene. So people must have just been connecting with some totally oddball aspect that seemed normal to me.
You mentioned screening the film for a certain section of the sound geek population. I want to talk a little bit about your involvement in sound geekage, shall we say. What's your own background with sound?
I don't have that much of a background in the technical aspects of recording. I went to film school. I learned how to record audio and how to sound design a film. And I've done that a couple of times, but my interest in making this film was more from the wanting to make something that sort of immersed me in the wilderness more than that's what I was looking for, more than something that immersed me in the world of sound. I didn't have any other sound-related ideas for films, but I had lots of other sort of wilderness-related film ideas that I didn't go for. I ended up learning a lot over the course of the couple of years that I spent making the film, and not just from Gordon, but then researching things on my own. But Gordon's a great mentor for learning how to sound record. So since then, I've sort of bought some of my own gear, and I'll head out into the forest at 4 a.m. to make my own recordings now.
So going into this project, into Soundtracker, you would say that your own enthusiasm, you had an enthusiasm more for the wilderness, which is where Gordon often records, than for the actual techniques and technology that him and his type of person uses then.
Yeah, I would say that.
Okay, well, what's the background to your wilderness enthusiasm then?
Well, I guess I was born in the D.C. area, actually not far from where Gordon is from originally. And my earliest memories are of catching frogs in the rivers and the streams and the lakes of Maryland. And then I moved to Colorado and got really into rock climbing and mountaineering and just being outdoors all the time. So then when I moved to California to pursue filmmaking, I'm always trying to find ways of returning to that. So that's one aspect, just from like a kind of that's part of my personality. But then I'm a huge fan of North American transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, poetry of Walt Whitman, John Muir's journals, and I read those religiously and always wanted to sort of put myself, almost to associate myself more with them by the works that I make. So I love that Gordon had once followed in the footsteps of John Muir's hike from San Francisco to Yosemite, and that fascinated me, and I love that Gordon was always talking about John Muir. I feel like their messages and their writing is still relevant, and so I'm trying to make works of art that are relevant to our society, but that are sort of done in the spirit of those earlier works.
It was a super fascinating element of the movie. Actually, it wasn't necessarily in the movie itself that I noticed this, of course. I mean, I was I noticed how Gordon was and the way he approached the outdoors. And then I was watching the interview you include on the DVD with you, where you talk about the transcendentalists and how, in a way, Gordon is kind of part of a new generation of those types of North American transcendentalists. And that, I mean, I heard you say that, and I was like, of course, how could I have not have considered that angle while I was watching the movie? But it all fits. And I want to know, with the original transcendentalists that you talk about, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, what resonates the most with you in the writings that these men did?
I think I'm attracted to the sort of radical aspect of it, the fact that that Thoreau was basically pioneering a literary genre all his own. I mean, his writings were not popular at all at the time, and now it's like the most quoted. He is the most quoted author in American history.
Right.
I guess there were a lot of writers at the time working on issues like self-reliance and individuality and stuff, but they're also kind of at the forefront of nature writing. This is when the national parks are starting to get founded largely through John Muir's effort. So I felt like they were the first sort of, prophets of the wilderness, telling us that there are things here to be appreciated. There's another way of life to be lived, and to start listening. And I feel like that's exactly what Gordon is doing today as well.
And so is this the same core message then that you want to, well, I mean, I don't know if message is the way you want to put it, and tell me how you do want to put it, but is this the same core of the work you want to do, the film work, you want to convey the same essence that the Transcendentalists did?
I think when you set out to make a film, you have certain ideas of what it's going to be like, and it's good to have those sort of as a constellation in the night sky to head towards, but you never know what's going to happen when you're making a documentary. If I were writing a fiction film, I might do exactly as you say. But making this film, there's a lot of unexpected things that happen. It's more important for me to stay true to the story that is actually taking place than the story that I wish were taking place. I think that's also something that makes Gordon's work unique. Instead of trying to create the perfect recording in a studio, he tries to find it in the environment. And the reason for that is because when you're just stuck in your own head and the ideas you have in your head, they never become greater than your own personal capacity for forming that idea. But when you're capturing something that's real, that's part of the world, then it has so much more potential for being greater. So I feel like I'd be doing myself and my art and my audience a disservice if I held too firmly to a fixed idea. In this film, I probably set out trying to make a transcendentalist film, and maybe in the end I made something, I don't even know it's probably a new term, a transcendentalist film, but and I don't know how closely I succeeded or not, or whether my next film will have anything to do with that. But you'll probably see me at watching a lot of films like that and wanting to make a lot of films like that. But I also try to be open to whatever's happening.
And I certainly agree with what you've said, that you don't want to be limited by your own imagination, because I think for anybody, the set of things they can imagine is much, much, much smaller than the set of things that can actually happen and exist in the world. And that's the documentary filmmakers I talk to. They all have kind of their own version of this, where they eventually say to themselves, it's the world is more interesting than whatever shape I can bend it into. So I'm going to capture what happens in the world. And I do want to talk about the unexpected things that happened in this film. But let me put it this way: as far as taking the Transcendentalists as an inspiration, of course you don't want to, as you said, you don't want to get a certain set of fixed ideas from them and be enthralled to those ideas. But could I say that you nonetheless would want to read the Transcendentalists and then I guess draw certain maybe principles from them that you can work by, not necessarily conclusions you have to arrive at or messages you have to convey, but it seems to me surely those writers, and maybe it's just using them as an examples of the way they lived and worked, they provide certain principles for you to work by.
Yeah, that sounds like something I would I would agree with.
I mean, I'm not saying name the principles, but what do you think you do draw from them that you can apply to your work without having it wall you in, if that makes any sense.
One thing would be strictly from a transcendentalist, a kind of Emersonian Thoreau approach of a person setting themselves outside of society and challenging the norms of society, largely from the perspective of standing in the wilderness and looking at society and saying, okay, we've all lived our lives a certain way, and we've all become very accustomed to that, but what if we altered it ever so slightly? What would that look like? That's something I love. I constantly challenging myself to break out of the bad habits I get from living in a city or from living a comfortable life, and I'm always looking for ways of making my life more difficult, more interesting, just to shake it up and see, well, is there maybe a different way of living that's more enriching, more meaningful to me? I feel like that might be one principle, just always seeking that out and telling stories that bring that out. Another is the simple, well, or not so simple idea of transcendence, of being in a world where there is something that fills it and transcends it at the same time. You can call that nature with a capital N, or spirit, or wilderness, or you can get into more religious versions of that. But there's something that causes awe and inspires feelings of the sublime, and to me, it's a feeling of making my soul feel more expansive. And I get that when I read the writings of the transcendentalists. I get that when I see films of certain filmmakers. There was a great book called The Transcendent in Film, where it was Yasujiro Ozu, Robert Bresson, and Carl Theodor Dreyer all have this transcendental style in their film. It's just people walking around, but you feel like they're walking around in a world that's filled with something a little bit more. I guess I think of that. I think of those other films as I'm editing my film to try to make something that takes us just outside of what's happening and to examine and say, whoa, maybe this is bigger, part of some bigger mystery.
And of course, you mentioned that book, The Transcendental in Film, with Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer. And are those specific filmmakers the ones that you also find that degree of transcendence in, or are there other ones for you? I know I'm a huge Ozu fan myself. Is probably in my top 3 filmmakers, and I can understand finding transcendence in him. Are those the ones for you as well, or do you have other filmmakers that really get you to that place?
Well, I think Herzog's documentaries also do. I'm not sure whether he would accept that claim, but I feel that same thing in a lot of his work. There are others, obviously, but those are my go-tos.
And it's interesting with Ozu, especially because the characters. I mean, this is going to sound like I have a very basic understanding of transcendentalism, but I think of that movement as so associated with the outdoors. Ozu's characters are typically in urban or urban settings or inside their homes, but yet you still find it achieves that even in these settings that it's urban Japan in the 50s. It's so far from the wilderness, but you can find this outside of the wilderness. I imagine you can find transcendence in the city as well. Or do you think yes or no on that one?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think we might be getting close to kind of the idea of transcendence is not enough. Is different than the tradition of North American transcendentalism. Emerson has a view of transcendence, or even of a transcendence god or power. But Ozu and Ozu might also, I don't know what, at least his films seem to imply that. But the North American transcendentalists, the Emerson, the Muirs, the Thoreaus, they talk about that in the same breath that they're talking about the wilderness. So, you can find, I guess, ideas of transcendence everywhere. Although they're not so common in film, which is why it's worth talking about. I guess they're not so common when done subtly. It's easy to have people talking about things, but what Ozu and Bresson and Dreyer do is they don't ever mention that, and yet you feel something when you watch those films You feel something that is best explained by having kind of caught a glimpse of something greater, a greater part of the mystery.
And the sort of syndrome in film of having things maybe talked about too much, or talked about when they should be felt or when they should be conveyed in some nonverbal way. That's pretty common in a lot of documentaries, but in Soundtracker you do avoid, at least I felt that, even though you have a lot of footage, a lot of sound of Gordon talking about what he does, I don't feel like it was ever too much of that. I feel like a lot of the joy or the transcendence or whatever he gets out of his work, I felt a lot of that came through in just hearing and seeing what he does, not necessarily what he says, although it's important what he says. But I mean, is that the same way you feel about your film, that this man comes through mostly not in his words?
Yeah, I think a lot of him comes through not in his words, and that's one of the things that I like about having the film out now, because he's been the subject of numerous magazine articles. He's in the Sun magazine this month. He's in Newsweek. Not this month. In previous months, he's been in Newsweek and Time. He'll be on he appears a lot with quite regularity. He's sort of America's acoustic ecologist of sorts. But there's something different about seeing him. And there's always something different about actually seeing somebody. You can learn so much from that. We're such a visual society, I guess it always helps. And to see that in time and with movement. To me, yeah, it would be, my favorite moments in the film are where I don't let him talk or say anything, and I'm just watching him, the way he sets up a microphone, the way he sits in the grass and listens, the way he repositions the little things. I love to see him listening to his own recordings, playing back, and to see how he reacts to them, to see when he laughs or frowns or has an almost ecstatic or almost erotic experience listening to certain sounds. It's really fascinating on screen. So I tried to maximize the moments where I could do that. But at the same time, I didn't want to alienate the audience and just have them have no idea what he was about. There were earlier cuts of the film where there was a lot less talking, and test audiences we're stuck with so many questions like, well, does he have a family? Does he do this for a living? Why is he doing this? Why is he doing that? That it sort of created more problems than it solved, and people were just sort of left wondering things that prevented them from getting into the story. So I tried to give them all the basic ingredients they need to know, okay, here's the Cliff's Notes version of who he is and what he's doing. Now we're going to watch him do it, and then I'm also going to let him sort of speak his mind and take us then deeper into the process, into a realm that you don't necessarily get from all the magazine articles, or you certainly don't get from the quick, sort of 3-minute news version that might appear.
And now, how did you first encounter Gordon, or how did he first come to your attention?
I had just gotten back from working as a cinematographer on another documentary film, a film called Journey from Zanskar, that Hoop Dreams director Frederick Marx shot in India. The two of us made that film, a totally improvised storyline, and it got me fired up and thinking, okay, I got to make a film of my own. And it was a pretty long. We were in the Himalayas and trekking and doing all sorts of things. And I got home and I was all grizzly and had long hair, and I was waiting for a haircut. And I was reading the LA Times one morning, and there was an article about Gordon on the front page of the nature section. It was called, I think, John Balzar's article, "A Voice for Silence," or something provocative that said voice and silence. And I thought, how does that make sense? And yet it makes perfect sense. And I read the article, and I sort of fell in love with this person who was portrayed in the article. And I just ran home and tried to find his email address, and I contacted him and sort of wrote him an impassioned email telling him who I was, what I was about, some life experiences to convince him that even though I didn't have the funding or the huge production company behind me, that I was still the guy to tell his story. And we exchanged a couple of emails, and a few months later, I flew up to his neck of the woods in Washington State, and we met and talked some more about it, and we got along really well. And from that moment, we started to talk about what a bigger film would be like, how it would happen. And I think the main reason why he decided to do it at this point in his life, he's never really allowed film crews to work with him. He's been approached several times, but it always presented too much of an obstacle to his own work. But we were a small crew; it was just two of us, and I think he got the sense from us that we would be incredibly respectful of his work, and that we didn't really have an agenda, that we were just going to watch him and observe him and be true to the process. And so with those conditions, he got excited about it, and he let us follow him. And so we just followed him, and we really had no idea what the film in the end was going to look like. But there are certain key things. But let's just say I had a good feeling that it was going to go somewhere. My instincts were telling me, okay, this guy is great. He drives around in this VW van. It looks awesome on camera. It's like his trusty steed. He's like Don Quixote, and that's his donkey, and Sancho is his human-shaped microphone, and he has this sort of Quixotic quest of finding quiet in a world that's getting increasingly noisy, and I knew something would happen.
We do see in the film this long trip that he takes, this as you said, the van he drives around, this great 64, and it seems like this is in the context of his recent work, this is a particularly important trip. Maybe it's longer than the ones he's been taking. I'm not sure that's what I inferred, but how close are we seeing in Soundtracker to what constitutes Gordon's job? Like how normal a journey is this for him? Is this something he's always doing? Is this like what's par for the course as far as his life and his work?
It's pretty close. Yeah, it's over the course of his career, he's gone on he's traveled the world several times over through funding from he had a Rolex grant, and he's had other grants that help him to take the more expensive trips to places like the Amazon or the Kalahari or Australia, because he does this for a living, and he doesn't have lots and lots of money to just sort of go everywhere, and he doesn't have a reality show or anything like that would just be like, okay, and now we're going to go to wherever our heart takes us. Like there's a very practical component to his work, which is if he's going to go spend a week searching for sounds in the wilderness, then he's got to go to a place where eventually he can, where that makes sense. And there's a definite purity to his work that sets him apart from a lot of other just sort of sound recording artists, where he'll actually just spend weeks and months going after a sound that he may never sell, that nobody has ever bought from him, but he thinks is important. And these are recordings that will have probably lasting cultural value to us. And like the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress have his recordings as part of their library. I think they also recognize the sort of value of some of these recordings. But he raised a family, and he couldn't just sort of leave forever. And the short answer is he goes off on these long trips. He tries to do them about once every year, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes life happens, and he can only get away for shorter periods of time, or he doesn't have the funding, or whatever. But he also lives on the outskirts of Olympic National Park, which is the quietest national park in the United States. And so that's kind of his playground. That's where, if you were to go up and if we were to call him right now, he's probably there listening. He's probably either surfing in frigid water, body surfing, or he's making a recording in the Hoh rainforest, or he's monitoring his 1 square inch location.
You mentioned, I believe, that you went surfing with him in that frigid Washington State water. I grew up in Washington State, so I know what you're talking about. Was that true? You went? He took you surfing?
Oh yeah. It's funny that that really popular vampire movie, the Twilight series.
Yes.
Those all take place in the town of Forks, Washington, which is sort of like our base camp, and it's incredibly amusing to see the Hollywood version of this town, which, to my estimation, has a really great old-fashioned coffee shop, and that's about it. But yeah, a lot of the sites from the soundtracker, the movie, are actually also in the Twilight series.
That is an overlap I don't think anybody would have guessed just to think about it. But that is excellent. Now, you mentioned his pursuit of certain recordings, that he gets it in his head. He wants a certain thing, and you have an excellent portrait of that in Soundtracker, where this is how I interpret it from the film, but tell me if I have this wrong at all, is that it seems like on the trip, on this long trip he takes that you record, he gets the idea that he might want to record a bird and a train at the same time, and have both of them audibly on the recording so that the listener can hear the train and the whistle of the train and the bird. Was that an idea that he did develop en route, or was he searching for that from the beginning?
No, he definitely developed that en route. And I'm happily say that I captured the genesis of it on camera sort of accidentally. He has two different types of recordings in the film. And I think it's important to keep the distinction, or it was important for me to recognize the difference. Because the first half of the film is him just being open to whatever happens. It's him trying to clear his mind, to clear any kinds of expectations of what he's going to record. He's heading off into an aspect of the Pacific Northwest where there is likely to be a lot of good sound listening opportunities, but he doesn't have like a checklist. Like, I need to get a blue heron, a blue grouse, and a duck or something. He doesn't have anything like that. He's just going off, and he's going to be open to whatever he's doing. So constantly while we're driving on the road, he's looking at maps, and he's looking out the window, and he's pulling over, and he just stands out by the side of the road and kind of shakes his head around, reorients his ears, and tries to, it's part of his process, he just tries to hear what's happening. And sometimes he would just record wind along the side of the road in that moment, or he might record the creaking of wood in a barn, or he might catch a glimpse of something in his mind, or he might see a lake in the distance and then go to the lake. But he's just recording anything. And so the process is more just being open. But then after you do that for a couple of weeks, then he started to form in his head an idea of a sound that he thought he could find, or he believed he could find, but he hadn't found it yet. And so then he wanted to find that thing. And so then that became the pursuit of a sound that he heard in his head, but he wanted to find in the world. And so that was different from the earlier ones where he heard them in the world first. And now it's much harder to create something in your head and try to find it than to just find anything. So this is where most of the frustration comes in, and this is also where we see his process, and we see kind of, all right, this is why sound recording is hard. You can't just set your microphone down in any old spot and create a good recording. And when he made the mental image of the sound and he went after it, that really, I think, that showed me his process in a way that I couldn't really reveal earlier.
If you've just tuned in, I'm Colin Marshall, and this is the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. My guest is documentarian Nicholas Sherman, director of Soundtracker, a portrait of sound artist Gordon Hempton. If you'd like to hear this interview again, or any other interview in the Marketplace of Ideas history, visit our website at colinmarshallradio.com or search for the Marketplace of Ideas on iTunes. You can even subscribe there. If you have any questions, comments, feedback of whatever kind, send that along, please, won't you, to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. Now let's get back to the conversation with Nicholas Sherman. There's this great moment, or this very revealing thing he says about this specific sound he's trying to get while he's walking along, and he's saying, a lot of people say to me, or a lot of people would say, why don't you just get the sound of a train, the sound of a whistle, and the sound of a bird and layer those in the studio and mix them just right? And he has a very convincing argument for why you shouldn't do that, and why, a photographer wouldn't grab the moon from one place, the mountains from another, the sky from another, and the result would be grotesque. But for some reason, people's minds go right to doing that for sound. And it's so funny because whenever I describe this goal of Gordon's from the movie, when I'm telling people about it, they will say, well, why didn't he just do this, mix it all in the studio? They invariably ask why he didn't do that. What do you think this speaks to, as far as why people would be willing to go straight to the why doesn't he just assemble this in the studio artificially conclusion, when, of course, as he says, rightly, they would never say, oh, you want to photograph something? Why don't you just assemble that in Photoshop?
Yeah, why didn't Ansel Adams just put a moon up there or something?
What do you think the difference is between people who think people can hold both these thoughts at once, but they seem so contradictory?
I think a lot of it comes from inexperience with the art form, the art of listening to sound recordings in society. I think most people have never even thought once about just that. I mean, we're so used to tuning sounds out, and especially for nature sounds, which are usually called ambient sounds or just background, as something that just sort of we're not aware of. And so why spend so much time trying to get something that we're just going to tune out anyway? I think some people would think that. It's also easy in our society to take the easy road, and I don't know, and maybe people also just don't even think that it's, I don't know, I guess people don't understand, maybe they don't immediately recognize the meaning of going after something like that. I mean, the real difference is when you listen to one of Gordon's sound recordings, you know that for a place and time, like let's say 6:17 a.m. on May 8th in 2006, the world sounded exactly like this. And if you like that, it's a chance for you to affirm the world you live in. And it's a celebration of where we are. But if he did just mix it in the studio, like everybody says, it would be a stupid image, and you would just say, it might even be a sad image, because you might say, that's so beautiful, but it doesn't exist anywhere, and you might become disheartened. And, and maybe you'd just be paralyzed and nothing in your life would ever change, and you wouldn't take advantage of that opportunity to grow. So, I mean, Gordon's all about having very positive, affirming message in his work, even though to some his pursuit seems very dire and depressing and impossible. But he wants to be a sort of positive voice. He doesn't want to just be another one of the environmentalists saying the rainforest is getting cut every day, and oil is everywhere, and the glaciers are melting, and everything is terrible. He wants to be somebody that says, look, he wants to inspire us with his love and his passion for sound and for the beauty of the way the world sounds, so that we fall in love with it, and then we're motivated out of a place of love and strength, as opposed to like fear and threat.
It is a fascinating way that he comes across in the film, because there are many moments where it seems like there's some degree of despair on his part, that there's a new power line up where he thought there wouldn't be a power line, and it buzzes and it's ruined another quiet place, and how there's so few places he can really find the quiet necessary to get a certain sound he wants. Or he seems to be of the mind that things are not changing for the better in terms of capturing this world of sound. But yeah, like you say, he's also inspiring in the sense that now he's really out to capture it. Now he's really got to record it, because it's not going to last forever. And it's a strange isn't so much the word, but he has this combination, I felt, of optimism and pessimism that I couldn't quite, I mean, he's neither of those, I don't think, in my mind. He's something that I can't quite pin down. It's kind of like the attitude he has in the film. It's like I can't tell if he's stern or if he's kind of a laid back guy. He falls somewhere in the middle of these qualities. I mean, do you agree that's how he was, or is that an image I'm just sort of inventing from what I've seen?
No, I think that's a pretty accurate thing. I don't know if I could find the right word either, or the way to express it. Certainly, if you were to ask him to talk about his feelings, he would talk almost completely about optimistic things, and that was kind of hard from a documentary standpoint because you need a little bit of drama in the film, and so I had to really work hard to break down some of those barriers to get him to the place where, like, okay, I know he loves this, and I know the world sounds beautiful to him, but I also know that he, more than anybody else in the world, is consciously confronted with how it could sound different, or how it sounds a lot different today than it did 20 years ago. I mean, most of us have no idea how it sounds different today than it did 20 years ago, because we weren't listening then and we're not listening now, but he was, and he knows exactly. And there has to be, to me, I think there has to be an element of sadness and remorse in that. It's like, but just the smallest little dose of optimism might be the smell of pine bark, which smells like vanilla to him, or a breeze or a sound he hears. It'll just kind of rejuvenate him. And he'll be his sort of eternally optimistic self once again. So, yeah, I don't know. I totally agree with what you're saying, though, and it's hard to describe.
And certainly the most interesting and most important thing about him as we see him in the movie is the work. You know, a lot of people aren't familiar with the ways that a field recordist gets field recordings, and so much of this is new. And, you know, I do a little bit of field recording myself, and a lot of this was new to me. And so I was watching and just trying to see what were his techniques to get what he gets. And that's really fascinating. But there's also a second layer, and it comes through in certain bits of the movie. The layer of his personality, to the extent that it can be separated from the collection of sound. There's a moment where, for example, in the van he's driving, and you're talking about he happens to be divorced, and talking about his marriage, and it seems to be the one thing he won't talk about is why that didn't quite work out. He does pass on that question, as I believe he says. And there's another moment earlier, which I found even more fascinating, that a lot of the people I know who are nature enthusiasts, who are, whether they record sound or whether they're photographers or if they just like to spend time in the natural world, they would call themselves spiritual but not religious. Gordon appears to be religious, and it seems different to me based on what I know, people I've met in these sort of circles. How much of his life outside of the actual recording, his sort of underlying, his inner life that didn't have to do with sound, did you want to include, or did you think it was right to include?
Not much, I guess. I wanted to paint a portrait of him, but there are a lot of ways to do that, and I wanted to stay true to his work and convey the aspects of him that I read into his work. Yeah, I guess his own personal stance towards religion, you sort of see that at the dinner table. I mean, I thought that was interesting, and that was a nice moment with his family. To me, that said more about his family and his background than anything else. But yeah, I specifically didn't want to go. It wasn't the point of the film to delve into his personal life at all. I mean, we all have our own stories, and there's a million different stories and different versions of it. And I wanted to more just the things that were relevant about appreciating his sound recordings, but of also understanding the costs that it's had on his life. I mean, in a sense, I think one of the things the film is about is how to follow your bliss and how difficult that can be and how rewarding. He's a model for that. He's found his calling and he's followed it through. And there aren't a lot of people, I don't know that many people who have done that so purely as he has. So when I think about the sorts of the way I want to live my life and my fears about actually doing it, I would often probably consult with Gordon and be, well, you know, is it worth it, or am I just being whimsical or foolish, or could I actually do this or do that? But I deliberately didn't sort of interview all the other people who knew Gordon. I didn't interview his ex-wife or his kids or other recording artists or anybody. It was more like, this is just, I wanted to keep it from his point of view, and I pushed him into areas that he didn't feel comfortable with at times. But I didn't want to abuse the access or to turn the portrait into something different than what it was.
You talk about the example of Gordon, or the consultation you might have with him that works as an example for you, and I think that even for me personally, seeing a guy who's so dedicated to what he needs to do, there is some inspiration to be found in that, both in the purest sense of the word inspiration, but practically as well, just seeing that a guy can actually live like this, doing this kind of thing. And what I suppose, what specifically do you learn from him in that sense that applies to your own craft? I mean, in a broad sense, he's going after his craft, he's perfecting it, and I assume that's what you want to do as well. But what lessons do you draw from the way that he's conducted his career? I mean, for quite some time he's been doing it.
Well, I like that he wasn't motivated by money in the beginning, or even now. I like that he decided to become a listener because he realized that he didn't know anything about listening. So he realized sort of late in his life, in his late 20s, that he had never truly listened to a thunderstorm, and that when he did, he learned so much about himself. And that's sort of when he realized that there were so many more things about his self and about his world that were just sort of unknown to him, and he wanted to know more of. And coupling that with his understanding at the time that also the sounds of nature were disappearing and vanishing, that he could do something that was good for the world but also good for himself at the same time. And he just started doing it. And that's why he started to record nature sounds. But for the first decade that he was doing it, he was supporting it through a career of bike messengering and getting into accidents and busting his body to make enough money to buy this expensive recording equipment so then he could leave work for a couple weeks, make these recordings, and come back. I mean, for probably the first 10 to 20 years of his career, there was just above the poverty line, like hard work. It's hard to follow your passion. If it were easy, everybody would be doing it. There'd be too many people doing it. You could never make any money doing it. Now he's kind of persisted so long and he's endured so long that his recordings are quite unique and exceptional, and his story is exceptional as well. And so, I don't know, I guess what I learned from him is that if you really want to live your life in the most meaningful way, it's probably going to be very hard to do that, but also very rewarding, and you probably won't have any regrets at the end.
The name of the film, once again, is Soundtracker. Nicholas Sherman, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Oh, thanks. It's been my pleasure.
If you'd like more information on Nicholas Sherman, Gordon Hempton, and Soundtracker, visit soundtrackerthemovie.com. I've been Colin Marshall. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. You can visit our website at colinmarshallradio.com, where you'll find our complete interview archive, or you can download them all and subscribe on iTunes by searching for the Marketplace of Ideas. Ben Althouse, the man who makes our theme music, is available on the web as well at benalthouse.com. Questions, comments? Tell me what you like, what you dislike about the show, anything you want to improve the show at Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. That's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. As always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas.